Somewhere beneath the mountain, there is a prison. A place of stone corridors, hidden mechanisms, and things that move in the dark. But Grimrock wasn't the only thing that was buried. Long before players entered its halls, another victim had already been entombed. An entire genre. The classic dungeon crawler had once been of gaming's greatest adventures, but by the early 2000s it had faded into obscurity, remembered only by a shrinking group of veterans and enthusiasts. The industry had moved on. The dungeon had been abandoned. Then, in 2012, a small team from Finland did something that nobody expected. They didn't modernize the genre, they didn't replace it, but they dug it up, exactly where it had been left. And against all odds, they made the world care again. This is the story of Legend of Grimrock. Hi, I'm Vandam, and today we are diving into the story behind the Grimrock games, the unlikely series that helped bring an entire genre back from the brink. But before we descend into the halls of Mount Grimrock, we need to go much further back to the origins of the dungeon crawler itself, to the games that defined the genre, the rise that made it legendary, and the slow decline that nearly buried it for good. Because the story of Grimrock is really the story of everything that came before it.
You're playing the most phenomenal game ever created.
Your skin grows cold from your first glimpse of the enormous beast.
It's a product of your imagination.
Survival depends on a quick, decisive move.
Your choices are limited.
Stand and fight, or run.
Use your lightning bolt.
Back in the 90s, dungeon crawlers were everywhere. If you owned a computer and had even the slightest interest in fantasy, chances are you eventually ended up trapped in some damn stone hallway getting mauled by something. Games like Dungeon Master and Eye of the Beholder basically defined the genre. Slow, grid-based RPGs, where the entire experience revolved around exploring claustrophobic dungeons, solving puzzles, fighting monsters, and obsessively checking every wall because one of them might secretly open for absolutely no reason. And because these games refused to explain anything to you, players drew their own maps on graph paper. It was fantasy at its purest, heavily inspired by, say, Dungeons and Dragons, just with less roleplay and significantly more starvation in various underground prisons. But then gaming started evolving. Fast. The late 90s and early 2000s saw games becoming bigger, louder, and far more cinematic. Suddenly, players wanted massive open worlds and real-time action, and compared to all of that, the old dungeon crawlers started feeling ancient, slow, and weirdly punishing. And so, quietly, the genre faded away. And by the 2000s, dungeon crawlers had basically vanished from the mainstream entirely, buried beneath newer trends and abandoned in old gaming forums and fan pages. Which makes what happened next feel even stranger, because more than a decade later, against all logic, someone brought it back. So the studio behind the Grimrock games was called Almost Human. The team consisted of just 4 friends from Finland. Yes, it's a Finnish indie game. Anyways, They all had grown up playing the old dungeon crawlers back when the genre was still alive and well, and after years of watching the industry move further and further away from those kinds of games, they eventually decided to do something back then completely unreasonable, and that's they brought it back. Their project was called Legend of Grimrock. On paper it sounded almost absurdly outdated for 2012, a classic grid-based dungeon crawler with puzzles, loot, monsters, death, and the feeling of misery when you died and forgot to save the last 2 hours of gameplay, the whole package. There were no gigantic open worlds, no cinematic set pieces, no NPC sharing their life story. It was just you, your party, a dungeon, and the constant feeling that every wall might contain either treasure or instant death. And somehow, people absolutely loved it. Because the thing that made Grimrock special wasn't that it reinvented dungeon crawlers, it barely even tried to. In fact, one of the game's biggest strengths was how stubbornly old school it was. It understood exactly why people loved these games in the first place. The tension of exploring the unknown, the satisfaction of solving puzzles on your own, and the paranoia of hearing a monster around the corner before you could actually see it. But Almost Human also understood something equally important. If they had made the game exactly like it was in 1992, nobody outside of hardcore old school fans would have probably cared. So instead, Grimrock became this incredibly smart middle ground between the old and the new. It kept the grid movement, the dungeon design and the slower pacing, but modernized everything around it. The visuals looked genuinely impressive for an indie game at the time, the interface was clean, combat felt fast enough to stay engaging, and the puzzles were just complicated enough to make players feel intelligent instead of homicidal. And the result was something nobody really expected. Legend of Grimrock became a massive success. Critics loved it, players loved it, and somehow, this bizarre little dungeon crawler, a genre the industry had practically abandoned for over a decade, went on to sell close to 1 million copies. Which revealed something really interesting. Dungeon crawlers hadn't disappeared because they were bad, outdated, or impossible to modernize. The audience was still there. People still loved the feeling of descending into dangerous labyrinths and uncovering secrets at their own pace. The genre hadn't died, it had just been forgotten. And the best part was that Almost Human was only getting started, because 2 years later, they released Legend of Grimrock 2, a sequel that didn't just improve the original, but expanded the genre in ways that dungeon crawlers had almost never attempted before. Legend of Grimrock 2 did what every sequel is supposed to do. It basically improved everything. And instead of throwing you into another giant dungeon, it stranded you on a tropical island. Finally, freedom, right? Nope, still grid-based. And it turns out that the entire island is still just one enormous dungeon, just wearing a Hawaiian shirt. Somehow, Almost Human managed to make a grid-based world feel surprisingly open. Forests, beaches, ruins, swamps, it all flowed together while still secretly being one giant puzzle box. Combat was smoother, puzzles were more creative, and exploration felt far more rewarding. Personally, I still love the oppressive atmosphere of the first game's endless descent, but Grimrock 2's world just had so much more personality. The story is pretty simple in both games. You're a prisoner trying to earn your freedom, except this time, an eccentric guy called the Island Master has turned this whole island into his own sadistic obstacle course, and won't stop talking to you for the entire time. It's weird, it's charming, it's honestly great. So, what happened? Honestly, nothing dramatic. There wasn't a disastrous launch, no massive controversy, and no catastrophic sequel that killed the franchise. Legend of Grimrock 2 reviewed well, fans loved it, and it sold fine. But fine isn't enough to keep an entire genre alive. Dungeon crawlers had spent decades becoming more and more niche. Most players had moved on to faster or more modern RPGs, and the audience that still loved mapping labyrinths on a grid just wasn't big enough to carry a full-scale revival. So, after the excitement faded, Grimrock slowly faded with it. Not because it was bad, but because it arrived at the wrong time. And what about the dungeon crawler as a whole? Well, they're still around, not in the spotlight but quietly tucked away in their own little corner of gaming. Every now and then a new one appears, keeping the torch alive for the people who never stopped loving these games. But for me, none of them have quite captured the same feeling as Legend of Grimrock. Maybe it's the atmosphere, maybe it's the puzzles, or maybe it's just nostalgia doing what nostalgia does best. Either way, I still catch myself hoping that one day someone will take another shot at bringing this genre back, because if Grimrock proved anything, it's that these games still have something special. Maybe they don't need to dominate Steam charts or win Game of the Year, maybe they just need to remind a small group of players why they fell in love with crawling through dark corridors in the first place. And honestly, maybe that's enough. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this little trip through one of gaming's forgotten genres, consider leaving a like or subscribing. I'd love to make more similar videos to this one in the future. So, until next time, try not to get lost in any suspicious looking dungeons.